Good afternoon, and thank you all so much for coming. My name is Alexis Gerganius, and I am the student president of the Buckley program. Before I introduce our esteemed guest, I would like to say a few words about the Buckley program. The Buckley program is dedicated to the promotion of intellectual diversity on Yale's campus. We achieve this goal in a number of ways, including our speaker events, debates, annual conference, summer internships for Yale undergraduates, and various other activities. Undergraduates and graduate students interested in learning more about the Buckley program should visit our website, buckleyprogram.com, to learn more about becoming a fellow. Our event with J.D. Vance is one of many great events we have this semester, and we will continue next Thursday with the firing line debate on the NSA and privacy rights. To find a more detailed schedule of events this semester, please visit our website, buckleyprogram.com. Now to introduce our speaker. Best-selling author J.D. Vance grew up in the Rust Belt city of Middletown, Ohio, in the Appalachian town of Jackson, Kentucky. He enlisted in the Marine Corps after high school and served in Iraq. A graduate of The Ohio State University and Yale Law School, he has contributed to National Review and the New York Times, in addition to appearing on Fox News, CNN, MSNBC, and CNBC. We will have time for questions at the end, so please raise your hand and we will bring you a mic. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Mr. J.D. Vance.
Well, thank you, and thanks to the Buckley program for having me, and thank you to everybody who came out tonight to hear me talk. As Alexis, said, I'll try to leave some time at the end for questions because it's always more interesting and fun for me to have a conversation with people and see what they think and see what they have to say, rather than just me standing up here and droning on at you for an endless amount of time. So please, while I'm speaking, think of questions you might ask, because if I get to the point where I say, does anyone have any questions, and you don't, it'll be very awkward for all of us to stand here and just stare at each other. But I'll start by giving a little bit of insight into why I wrote the book in the first place. And so, as I mentioned in the introduction, it's a pretty bizarre thing for a 30, 31, 32-year-old person to write a memoir. But I was very motivated to write the book because I was troubled by this question that I had when I was here at law school. So this is 2012, 2013, and I'm recognizing as I navigate through the various crazy obstacles that Yale Law School places in front of you and the crazy opportunities too, and really wondering why I felt like such a cultural outsider. And what I mean by that is not that I felt especially oppressed in any way. I didn't feel like anyone was making fun of me or too critical of me. But what I felt is that I just was really a sort of foreign species at this place. There weren't very many people like me. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to conduct myself. I didn't know how to navigate the various social and career networks that I encountered. And so a corollary of that question is that if I felt like such an outsider in this place, then maybe a lot of kids like me weren't actually doing especially well. As all of you probably know, institutions like Yale and Yale Law School are gatekeepers to so many opportunities that exist in our society. And if I felt like such a cultural outsider, then it probably meant that there were very, very few kids growing up like me who had access to this real gatekeeper, and that bothered me. Of course, while I was thinking about writing the book and I was concerned about this question of what economists and sociologists call upward mobility in a very real, personal way, there was a lot of good research being done about why the United States doesn't have quite as much upward mobility as other parts of the world. And interestingly, that phenomenon, the fact that the United States doesn't do as well on measures of upward mobility, meaning effectively the odds that a poor kid can actually become middle class or eventually wealthy, the reason we weren't doing so well, or the fact that we weren't doing so well on this question of upward mobility, was largely a regional phenomenon. So if you look at a place like Utah or Kansas or San Francisco, the United States was actually doing pretty well. A poor kid born in the bottom in some of these places actually had a pretty good chance of rising through the socioeconomic ladder. But if you look at the part of the country where I came from, Southern Ohio or Eastern Kentucky, if you look at the so-called industrial Midwest or the Southeast, upward mobility there is not doing very well at all. A kid born in the bottom quintile of the socioeconomic scale has a 5 to 10% chance at the very high end of making it to the top. And I think that implicates something not just that's very important to me personally as someone who's experienced this upward mobility, but as a country, it really strikes at the core of our identity, this idea that in the United States, poor kids can purely through the function of their own efforts and their hard work can have all the opportunities that a wealthy kid can have. It's really important, I think, to our core identity as Americans. If you look at polls, Americans from across the political spectrum consistently don't express that much concern about inequality. And one of the reasons people theorize why that is because we're less concerned about fairness as such than we are about whether kids have real opportunities, right? But if kids, especially concentrated in certain areas of the country, don't have that much opportunity at all, then I think it really says something very important and very troubling about our identity as a country. So I was concerned about that, and that's why I started writing the book. And when I looked at some of the academic research and when I looked at the things that had been talked about in the field, I realized that in a lot of ways we were having a very ideological conversation about why there wasn't so much upward mobility in the United States. On the right, you might hear some version of the reason the poor aren't doing especially well is because they're fundamentally pathological. There's something about them that makes it hard for them to do especially well in the country. Or maybe a more compassionate view would be they're not doing especially well because the economic incentives don't exist for them to do well. Maybe the social safety net is holding them down in a certain way. It's preventing them from going and getting good jobs as opposed to living off the dole. And on the left, you might hear somebody say something to the effect of, well, the reason these people aren't doing especially well is because our society is fundamentally unfair. We have underfunded public institutions, public schools, and so forth. Or maybe it's just the fact that there aren't enough good jobs that exist in these regional economies. The reason, let's say, that somebody in southwestern Ohio isn't that likely to achieve their share of the American dream is because southwestern Ohio's economy is bad, because its public schools are bad, and so forth. But what I thought that conversation often missed, and certainly what I saw in my own life, is that both of those things were true, but there were also a lot of other things that were true simultaneously. So it wasn't just a question of what the government or the economy wasn't able to provide for these kids, so that was certainly important. And it wasn't just a question of whether people were lazy or held down by bad social policy, though I thought in some cases that was also true. There was a much more important question about the things that existed between government and the individual. Institutions of civil society, family, neighborhoods, communities, churches, the things that we often neglect when we talk about policy and politics, but when I looked back at my life and when I looked at the data, I thought were incredibly important. So I decided to write a book that tried to explore those things, that didn't try to say, no, the economy isn't important, no, government policy isn't important, no, individual choices don't matter, but that there are other things that matter. There are so many other things that are going on in the lives of these people, in the lives of poor children, and let's try to understand what that is. Let's try to walk through it. That was why I wrote the book, and for those of you who haven't read it, I'll give just a little bit of an overview of how I think those mediating institutions, as sociologists might call them, really affect kids who grow up like I did. So there's an important point to be made about social capital. And what I mean here is the value that people derive from their information networks, from the people who are in their lives. If you think about what it's like to apply for a job when you come from a place like Yale, very often it involves giving a career services officer or giving a friend or maybe even a parent a resume and saying, could you pass this on to somebody who might be able to give me a job or at least an interview? That's a world that I first encountered here at Yale, but I had never seen it operate outside of this institution. When I wanted to get a job right after I graduated from college, when I wanted to get a job in high school, what I did is fill out as many resumes as possible with almost no hope that anybody would ever call me back. But that's not how successful people actually operate in the 21st century economy. They rely on those information networks to get them access to people, to learn important things about how the job market or a given industry function. But social capital operates in other ways too, other very important ways. So I tell this story in the book, and please forgive me if you've already heard it, but the first time that I ever went to a law firm networking dinner here at Yale, not actually too far from this hotel, I was at the fancy French restaurant just a couple of blocks away from here. I always forget the name. But I remember showing up and just being so blown away by the fineries of the restaurant that I couldn't even conduct myself like a normal functioning adult. I thought that the linens on the tables were so nice, and I just remember needing to touch these linens, but doing it in a way that nobody saw me because I didn't want them to think I was weird. And I remember somebody offering me a glass of wine, a waitress, and I said, sure, I'll take some white wine. And she said, would you like the Chardonnay or the Sauvignon Blanc? And my reaction to that in my head was to think this woman is actually screwing with me. I just want some white wine. Stop with the fancy French words and give me my white wine. But I used my powers of deduction to realize were two separate types of white wine. And so I told her that I'd take the Chardonnay because that was the one that was the easiest to pronounce. There were other moments like that just in that night. I didn't know how to use all the utensils that were laid out before me. I had never and still don't understand why rich people feel the need to have 2 butter knives at every meal. I think 1 butter knife is overkill. You can just use your finger or a spoon, but that's fine. It's of course funny and it sounds trivial, but when you're trying to get a job, when you're trying to impress employers, when you're trying to figure out how to do the things you need to do so that these people leave with a good impression of you, it goes to show that not knowing how to conduct yourself in these environments can actually cause problems. I talk a lot in the book about the role of religion, a very important social institution in my life, and we think of the area of the country that I came from as part of the Bible Belt. People self-identify as evangelical Christian in incredibly high numbers. But if you actually look at the data, church-going in these areas, despite the fact that people self-identify as Christians, is actually starting to fall off. Church, despite the stereotype, is much more common among upper-income, upper-education people than it is among the lower-income and lower-educated people. So despite the fact that people are self-identifying as Christians, they're not accessing some of the important social benefits of religion because they're not actually participating in a community church. Despite the fact that I was an intensely religious kid and grew up in a very religious family, I didn't even start going to church regularly until I was 14 or 15 years old. And what's so striking about this is that there are real benefits to going to church, whether you believe in God or not. There's a very fascinating paper by this guy, Jonathan Gruber, who, if you've heard his name, you probably think of it in the context of Grubergate, because Jonathan Gruber was one of the chief policy architects of Obamacare, and there were all these YouTube videos of him talking about Obamacare in not necessarily positive ways. It made a lot of waves recently, but he wrote this really fascinating paper where he found, first of all, unsurprisingly, that people who go to church regularly, they drink less, they're more likely to graduate from high school, they're more likely to not do drugs, they're more likely to go on to college and so forth. But importantly, he found that relationship was causal. It wasn't just that successful people were already going to church, it's that church in its social function seemed to actually inculcate some of the values that we'd like people to have for them to be successful. But if you think of a community where church is increasingly all talk and very little social institution, a lot of those positive benefits don't accrue to some of those folks. I talk a lot about soft skills in the book. And the reason very often that kids like me don't do especially well is not necessarily because we weren't given a fantastic education as children, though sometimes that's certainly true, but I was given access to textbooks, I was taught math and reading and English pretty well. But the things that I didn't know when I got to Yale, the real knowledge gap that existed between me and the students who seemed to know what they were doing, was that I didn't have some of the softer knowledge about how to conduct myself as an adult. I didn't know how to balance a checkbook. I didn't know that if you wanted to go buy a car, you probably shouldn't buy a BMW if you only make $15,000 or $16,000, which is what I made in the Marine Corps. You should go get a cheaper car. And instead of accepting the dealer's first offer on a high interest rate loan, you should actually go and shop around. This is basic financial common sense. And a lot of folks learn these things from their information networks, from their family and friends, but I just didn't know them because I grew up in an environment where prioritizing and even making financial decisions like that just wasn't part of the everyday conversation. All of this conspired in a certain way to give me a certain sense of hopelessness. And this is something that I talk about in the book that I think is really important. When you don't have access to these social institutions, when you don't see other people succeeding, when, if you're lucky enough to make it to a place like Yale Law School, you feel like a foreign alien, there's something to be said for the expectations that you start to develop, the way that you start to see hard work and ability and how they factor into success. Now, to me, the kids who succeeded when I was, a 14 or 15-year-old kid, those who did especially well for themselves were just different in a fundamental way. I saw people who went to Yale as so smart, as so brilliant, that there was no way that I could possibly compete with them. There was no way that I could even hope to participate in an institution like that. And I think that's such an interesting contrast because my then girlfriend, now wife, I was talking to her father a few years ago. She is a second-generation immigrant. And I was talking to him about the difference between ability and hard work. And I told him, Chris, you've raised these two beautiful daughters who are incredibly successful. One's an engineer, one went to Yale. How did you do it? How did you raise these brilliant young women? And he said, they're not actually that smart. They're just really hardworking. But that way of thinking about achievement, that way of identifying achievement as primarily something that's inborn as opposed to something that's born of hard work, that's something you start to believe when no one around you makes it, right? It's very hard to say all you need to do is work hard when every single person that you see around you working hard doesn't actually live that great of a life, right? And it's important to recognize the way that we internalize this hopelessness, the way that kids often internalize these low expectations, because it really influences what they think is possible, what they think is out there for them. And I think that it starts to affect how they perceive their society, whether it's open, whether the doors of opportunity are something that's attainable to them, or whether it's something that's completely foreclosed for kids like them. And if you think about it, if you really don't believe that these opportunities are for you or for the people who grew up like you, it starts to create certain resentments, not just at our culture and at our country, but at our politics. And I'll talk about that in a sec. And the last thing that I want to talk about in a broad institutional sense is this question of family. Because we're uncomfortable in a lot of ways with talking about the way that family can become a reproducer of either advantage or of disadvantage. I saw a lot of abuse in my family. I saw a lot of emotional trauma. I saw people throwing plates and silverware at each other when they got in fights. I saw police haul my mom off in a police cruiser once. These are things that just happened in our family, and unfortunately they happen way too commonly in our broader community. There's evidence to suggest that as many as 40% of working class children in this country see multiple or experience multiple instances of childhood trauma during their life. And we know, thanks to really excellent research by pediatricians and social psychologists, that this childhood trauma actually starts to affect the way these children's brain develop. It's not just that they see a chaotic environment, they see dad hitting mom, and then they eventually get over it. It's that those things that they see start to develop and inform the expectations that they have for their own family life. It causes them to not do as well at school. It causes them to look for outlets in drugs and alcohol. And unfortunately, it causes them eventually to treat their children very often in the same way that they were treated as as children themselves. So it's like this gift that keeps on giving. It's not just that you see terrible things happening at home. It's that you see them, you internalize them, it affects your behavior, and then when you have children of your own, it starts to change how you parent yourself. This is in some ways the story of my family. It's not that that I was the first person in my family, I was the first generation in my family to see this childhood trauma. It went back multiple generations. And consequently, it's not something that's necessarily easy to turn off. As I learned, I got to Yale, I had a good job offer, there were a lot of good things going on in my life, but the first person that I truly fell in love with, I treated her just as badly as I was treated as a kid. I yelled at her and I screamed at her, and I did everything that I promised myself that when I got out I would never do. But I did those things because it's not easy to just flip that switch off. It's not easy to achieve some measure of elite credential and all of a sudden forget every lesson that you acquired when you were growing up. And that's important not just in the realm of childhood trauma, but it's important in the realm of how we develop expectations about what's possible, how we navigate these social networks, how we navigate religious institutions if we're lucky enough to access some religious institution or another civic institution. The point is that however you think that America's poor got in the situation that they're in, whether you think it was because they were treated extremely unfairly, whether you think that they got there because something incredibly pathological about their culture prevented them from succeeding in life and in work, they are there now. And the things that happen in their families and in their communities make it harder for their children to succeed. Now, that doesn't mean, of course, that the economic stuff is unimportant. That doesn't mean that government policy is hopeless to address these problems. But if we're going to actually address these problems, I think we have to respect both the scale and the scope at which these challenges exist. It's not purely a lack of income, though more money would certainly help. It's not purely a lack of access to good jobs, though better jobs and better job training would certainly help. There are a whole host of complex factors that are affecting these people and the way they grew up. And because I didn't think that we were talking enough about those complex factors, I wrote the book. And that's really, hopefully, the takeaway of those who write it, or those who read it, excuse me. I want to say something about culture, and then I want to say something about politics. And then I'll shut up, and hopefully you guys have some questions. So the point about culture is that it's incredibly weaponized in the way that we talk about poor Americans these days. And I think that it's weaponized for reasons that are not the fault of poor people themselves. We often say things like the culture of poverty. And that stops a conversation that should really just be starting. But because when we say that poor folks suffer from a culture of poverty, what are we really talking about? Are we sort of saying there's no hope for them? Because I don't think that's what most people want. That's not what most people think. Are we saying that kids who grow up like I did and internalize the childhood trauma and the low expectations they grew up around, that they're somehow pathological and completely outside the realm of possibility to help? I don't think that's what we're saying. So I think that we should be very careful about the way that we deploy the word culture and how we talk about the problems of poverty and inequality. So let me suggest an alternative definition, a definition gleaned from my own life, and a definition that I think some of the best scholars who are talking about culture and poverty right now use, folks like Orlando Patterson and William Julius Wilson. When we talk about culture, we're talking really just about the things that you see, the attitudes that you see in your community, the habits that you form growing up in a certain circumstances, and the fact that all of those things continue to affect you for the rest of your life. It's a relatively intuitive concept that the way that you grow up and the things that you see when you're growing up, they don't just go away the moment that you achieve some measure of financial or educational stability. They're there with you, and they continue to have long-lasting effects. That's an important way to talk about culture, and that's the way that I hope that we will be talking about culture in the future. And the last point that I'll make, the last topic that I'll discuss is this question of politics. I said earlier that I hoped that people would read my book and take away from it an appreciation for how truly complex some of the problems that I write about are. That continues to be my real hope for those who read the book, but of course a lot of people have read the book because they're trying to understand this incredibly bizarre political moment that we find ourselves in. It is a political moment where a person who almost no one expected to win the Republican nomination is now 8 days or 10 days or so into a new administration. And I want to harken back to a point that I made earlier, this sense of feeling like the doors of opportunity are shut to you. Because in this conversation about Donald Trump and whether his support is primarily driven by economic anxiety or racial animus or something else, we often miss that the most important metric of economic well-being in a lot of people's lives is not how they're doing, but how they expect their children to be doing. And in a world where so many opportunities seem foreclosed, in a world where fewer and fewer people are seeing their children do better than them, it would be stupid of us to not expect that would affect our politics in one way or another, and indeed it has. Now, political realignments are slow. They don't happen overnight. And I'm cognizant that I'm standing here as a conservative at the Buckley Foundation's at a Buckley Foundation event. And of course, William F. Buckley is the founder of modern conservatism. He is in some ways the intellectual godfather of what Ronald Reagan accomplished politically and all those who came after him. But I think that we are in for a political realignment, the likes that we haven't seen since at least William F. Buckley was one of the most influential, if not the most influential public intellectual in America. Because even though, if you look from 30,000 feet, the demographics of the electorate don't seem that much different, right? Republicans won primarily on the backs of working class, middle class, and upper income white Americans, and the Democrats collected primarily upper crust, hyper elite white Americans and minority Americans from across the class spectrum. Those two political constituencies still seem fundamentally intact if you look at the electorate from very far away, but if you drill in, I think that there are very important things that are happening. They've been happening for a while, and they became very obvious in 2016. One of those things is that folks who voted for Donald Trump were much more likely to be blue-collar, much less likely to have a college degree than effectively at any time in the Republican Party's recent history. The Republican Party is, whether the elites of the party like it or not, becoming very much like the FDR New Deal coalition of the 1930s, primarily working class and middle class Americans, and much less attraction among upper middle class and upper class Americans. Again, that shift hasn't happened overnight, and it won't happen overnight, but it's really starting, and the data is pretty clear that it's happening. An important fact about the electorate is that of the approximately 3,000 counties in our country, 2,500 counties voted for Donald Trump. And in those 2,500 counties, about 35% of the economic activity in the country happens. And in the 500 counties that Hillary Clinton won, about 65% of the economic activity happens in those counties. And so if you think about that, a picture of the Democratic and Republican electorate starts to form. Again, it's working and middle-income folks in middle America who occupy the Republican Party's electorate, and it's extremely well-to-do white Americans and minorities from across the political spectrum that are voting Democratic. And the difference is that more working class and more true middle class Americans are shifting over to the Republican Party. That's an important point, and I think that's going to continue to affect our politics over the next 20 or 30 years. Now, whether you think that realignment is a good thing or not, whether you agree with the policy that comes out of this realignment or not, and whether you think that Donald Trump is going to be a good president or is the worst thing to ever happen to American democracy, we should be mindful of the fact that so many people feel left behind. And it's not just working class white Americans that I write about in the book. The most underreported election story in my mind is not that so many working class white Americans switched from Obama in 2008 to Trump in 2016, though that's certainly true. It's that so many of the minority, working and middle-income Americans who voted for Obama in 2008 just stayed home in 2016. We have two things going on, but they're really just one thing going on. We have a working class and a middle class that is increasingly unhappy with the political direction of the country. And if you read the book, you know that I don't think that there are easy answers to these questions. It's not like a government can flip a switch and make everything better in the lives of America's poor. But I think that we have to be asking these questions about the things that government can do, the things that other institutions in our society can do, because it is untenable for a society to have so many people feel like the deck is stacked against them, and when you look at the data, they're not totally wrong. So, with that, I'll shut up and the very last thing I'll say is that it really is an honor to be here. It's an honor to be back at New Haven. It's an honor to be back at Yale. And it's especially an honor to be at the podium where William F. Buckley, one of my great intellectual heroes, where he really is, his spirit, the spirit of good conversation, the spirit of intellectual rigor is very alive in this organization. And I'm very glad that it had me, and I'm honored. Thank you.
Hi, thanks so much for coming. I've really enjoyed your book.
Thank
my
you.
name is Nathan Hall. I'm a former coal miner from Eastern Kentucky. I'm currently a student at the Yale School of Management and School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. So I know exactly what you mean when you say you can feel like an alien here. Also, just a quick note, I'm working on economic development in southern West Virginia, Eastern Kentucky, where we're repurposing former mine lands to be sustainable agriculture and renewable energy sites. So it'd be great to catch up with you on that at some point.
Absolutely.
In the spirit of trying to ask a question here, so when I talk to folks back home who've read the book, some of my more progressive friends from Eastern Kentucky, they feel like there's maybe a little bit of an element missing, where looking back at kind of the systemic issues that help to create some of the poverty, the problems that we have in the region, specifically the fact that ever since industrialization came to the region, it was always from a pretty exploitative type of implementation, with the coming of the railroad, timber, and coal companies, and the coal company towns, et cetera, and the kind of way that informed the culture. Even though that was a long time ago, it seems like a lot of those systems have kind of stayed in place. Of course, that's only talking about coalfield Appalachia, but I can only imagine similar systems were in place in the Rust Belt towns where large company factories, company housing, et cetera. Can you speak a bit to how you feel that the history of pretty undiversified industry, very labor-intensive industry may have come to inform some of the cultural issues that we have at this time?
Sure. So a couple of thoughts in response to that one. First, it's one of the things I say at the outset of the book, and maybe I should have been more clear about it. But I say effectively, look, I think there's clearly an economic element to a lot of these problems. There's clearly a cultural element to a lot of these problems. And I'm going to talk about the cultural stuff because I don't like the way that it's talked about, and I don't think it's especially well appreciated for some of the reasons I stated earlier. But, the economic stuff is obviously important, right? And if you don't appreciate the fact that coal jobs have left in West Virginia and Eastern Kentucky, and steel jobs have left in southwestern Ohio, and paper jobs have left in other areas, then I don't think you're truly appreciating the role that a rapidly declining manufacturing economy can have on the environment and the place that these industries used to operate in. Because one of the social institutions that conservatives often don't like to talk about, but that's really important, is labor unions, right? I mean, talk about a place that gives folks community, that has various social pressures associated with it. I think that's got to be an important part of the conversation. But I will say that on the question of how, you asked about the history, right? And there's all this literature in Appalachia. There's the internal colonial model of how Appalachia got to be so poor in the first place. There are a number of different explanations that are out there. And I was aware of them, and they were sort of in the background as I was writing. But I sort of decided to segregate that question and to be agnostic about it. Because whether these folks are poor because the coal mines were exploitative, or whether they were poor because of something else, or whether it's a combination of a number of different factors, it struck me that it was important to recognize that they're poor now, and there are things that are completely independent of how they got poor that continue to have negative externalities down the road. And so it's more a question of focus than a belief that the coal mines or coal companies are 100% blameless in how Appalachia got poor in the first place. I just try to be agnostic about the book because I was trying to bite off, a smaller piece to chew on. I see a lot of hands here, so okay. Okay, we got a moderator. That's good.
So as these like middle institutions have declined, like family and work and religion, what is the best way for government to intervene in those cases where it seems like a lot of the time individual choice plays a huge factor? If church going is a really significant social factor, how can government intervene in order to try to promote that, and should it? And similarly with family, which is something very personal, do you think that it's feasible for government to intervene there? And if so, what are the like best policy tools, I guess, that we have to attempt interventions in those spheres?
Sure. So in the abstract, it's feasible to me that government could intervene and play a positive role. Before I get to that, I want to just say something about the role of government policy, because I see a lot of students here, and it's very easy, I think, to sort of look at big social problems and to only be thinking at them through the lens of how can government solve this social problem. It's not to say that government doesn't have a role to play, but it's important to recognize that there are nonprofits that people could go start. There are businesses that people could go start that could employ some of these people that don't have great jobs right now. There are a lot of different things that we can do as individual actors that I think would help a lot. And I try to encourage students especially to be thinking about the problem in a sort of longitudinal way, right? Don't just look at what we can do at the very top, sort of look at what we can do closer to the bottom of some of these social problems. So that said, I'll answer your question in a specific way, and then I'll punt on it a little bit because I think it's really hard. So in a specific way, I do think that there are things that government could do that would be a little bit more open and promotional towards community institutions as opposed to maybe replacing them or even playing a destructive role. So a couple of ideas come to mind, and these are ideas culled from personal experience, from conversations I have with people in Ohio. So one is this terrible opioid crisis, which may have not hit New Haven especially badly, but is the thing that people in Ohio are most worried about. It's the leading cause of accidental death in the state. In the county that I grew up in last year, it was the leading cause of death even above nature, overdoses from opioids. So it's a problem that folks really have on their mind. And one of the problems that's out there is that there isn't real neutrality in how government funds some of the different solutions, right? So I know people who try to take people into their home, try to take addicts into their home, because you have to be detoxed first before most treatment centers will take you for various insurance and liability reasons. So you need somebody who's going to do the detoxing for 2 or 3 days, right? But folks often find that there's absolutely no access to funding to help put food on the table or help provide an extra room for somebody so that they can take them into their home and detox them for 2 or 3 days. And there are a lot of church groups that encourage their members to offer their homes to people to do detox, but those church members are not eligible for some of the funding that sort of government institutions or public health groups are able to get. So I think in some ways it puts local problem solvers at a disadvantage relative to more established institutions, and that's something that really bothers me. The other thing that government could really do here, and I think would be extraordinarily helpful, is to make it easier for people to get different jobs or to acquire the skills that would allow them to go back to work. Because we in this country are really bad, and there are a lot of European countries who are a whole lot better at training people for 21st century knowledge economy jobs without forcing them into a 4-year degree program. And so to the degree that work is an important institution, and I think that it is, to the degree that it provides people not just a livable wage, but actually a dignified sense of purpose, the things that we could do to help promote actual solid job retraining would be incredibly powerful. And I'm not naive enough to think that you can retrain every 55-year-old coal miner into a software developer job. But could we do a whole hell of a lot better than we do right now? I think the answer is yes.
Hi. I actually grew up in western Pennsylvania and eastern Ohio, and I went to 4 different grade schools because I followed my father in a failing steel industry. During that time, I saw downriver, you could identify each town by the color of the smoke coming out of the smokestacks. Then they passed air control measures, and now I'm having discussions with siblings about the fact that we have clean air and clean water, and clean air and clean water are actually restricting jobs. The other thing that's going on in this current election is that people that I know in Ohio and Western Pennsylvania are looking at the internet for sources of information, and it seems that they're all in their own little bubble, that they're reading things that fit into their own profile, so that they're reading that, oh my goodness, they took these jobs away because they had to put scrubbers on the smokestack. And so actually there's sort of an interscene rivalry going on in terms of who's reading what where, what's valid, what are alternate facts. And obviously I'm more than old enough to be your mother, perhaps even getting into grandmother territory. So I've seen this go on for a long time, but I have to say that with my grandchildren, who are also on the internet a lot, and they're getting a lot of facts there, and I also spent 20 years in a school system working as a teacher, that a lot of people are getting unsubstantiated information, and I think part of the role that teachers should be filling is how to vet the information they're getting. And I'm wondering if you're seeing any effect through the internet on what's happening in the places that you grew up.
Sure. So I wrote about this in the book, actually, and I'm going to be not humble for a second and say that it was one of, in my opinion, the more prescient parts of the book, where I talk about the various ways in which people believe some of these internet conspiracy theories, and the high share of people who believe that Barack Obama was born in Indonesia or Kenya or wherever he was supposed to be born. And I think that it's something that I've worried about for a long time. It was one of the very earliest sections of the book that I wrote. So it's something that I've noticed. And I'm gonna offer a couple of thoughts on it. The first is that the media, like any other of these institutions, is really important, and it's declining in these areas, right? So it's not just the people are going to the internet for their sources of news, it's that the local community paper, which again is an important institution, has effectively declined or disappeared in a lot of these communities, right? You go on the internet as your sole source of information because the Middletown Journal, which used to be my local paper, is now, I think, the Hamilton Journal News, which covers a much broader region. It doesn't have quite the resources that it used to because the advertising model completely blew up. And so people don't feel like they have a real connected local source of news, and I think that's a big problem. I don't know how to solve that problem because it's not like the government should go around and give massive subsidies to every single local newspaper. That would be incredibly expensive. But I do think we have to contend with the fact that a large part of the reason that folks have lost faith in the traditional media institutions are that the traditional media institutions used to be run by their neighbors and their friends, and now they're run by people they never see who live in some, typically coastal city. A related point, and something that in some ways my mind has changed a little bit on this since I wrote the book. I've become a little bit less critical of the area where I grew up for accepting this stuff. And it used to really frustrate me when I was in college, when I was in the Marine Corps even, and people would believe these ridiculous videos of how 9/11 was an inside job, or they would believe some ridiculous statistic or fact about President Obama. I increasingly worry, especially in the way that folks are reacting to the Trump presidency, that we have a media credibility problem that isn't purely the fault of the people who are listening to the media. And I'm not saying there aren't sort of active efforts to undermine traditional media institutions, because there are, right? There are all these competing businesses that are coming to the fore that are hurting. But the way that I think about this is you could have watched television in early 2003 and watched media, political, journalistic elites of both the left and the right agree that Saddam Hussein was a massive existential threat, that the Iraq War would be a great military triumph, and that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. Now, I happen to not believe any of those claims were maliciously stated, but they were all ultimately proven false. So that cost the media a lot of credibility. In 2007, you could have sat in a room with financial elites, with policy elites, with political elites of both the left and the right, and they would have told you that despite the fact that housing had been dropping for the past 6 to 12 months, the fact that housing prices had been dropping, the economy was fundamentally okay and there was no major problem with complex financial products, right? But they were both wrong. You could have watched CNN 3 days before the election and not a single commentator, and I blame myself because I was on CNN quite a bit, would have told you that Donald Trump had a very reasonable chance of winning the election, despite the fact that all of the polls were within the margin of error. It's not like the polls really missed this election, it's that the interpreters of the polls really missed this election. And so I think that we have to appreciate that this isn't just a problem of fake news, though that is a problem. We have a real problem with media credibility that isn't totally the fault of the people who are listening to the media. And I think as someone who is very worried about the way that people arbitrate between different sources of information and really wants to have a powerful, well-trusted fourth estate, the most important question for the media over the next 4 years isn't how to be successfully oppositional to the Trump administration, though again, the media has to be oppositional to an administration, whether it's a Democrat or a Republican. It's how to rebuild credibility. And so I think this is a major problem for our society. Why is it that something like 17% of people believe the media, quote unquote, is a credible institution? We really can't function effectively, especially given how low the barrier to entry is for all of this ridiculous information that you talked about before and that I'm very worried about. We can't function unless there is a credible arbiter of all of this news information, and I worry that we haven't figured out how to rebuild that credibility. It's certainly gone, and we've got to rebuild it.
Hello, my name is Brian. Thank you for the
Hi,
Buckley
Brian.
Foundation for hosting this, and thank you for coming to speak. As a low-income student from a community college who transferred to Yale, I identified a lot with what you talked about feeling out of place here. I'm also in a t-shirt and shorts, so I definitely feel out of place right now, too. Actually, jeans. In your book, you kind of mentioned how there's a brain drain, where a lot of people who do happen to get skilled and educated leave these towns. For example, you got an education at Yale Law, and then you went off to Northern California. How do we kind of reverse that course so these cities also have these economic drivers? And are you ever planning to move back to the Midwest? What are your future business, personal, and/or political goals?
Well, I didn't hear the last part of that question, so I'll start at the beginning and stop in the middle. So so first of all, I actually just moved back to Ohio in the past couple of weeks. So I've tried. Thank you. I have. I saw an OH over there. Nice. So I try to practice what I preach when I go around and I tell people that they should be thinking, not that they have to go back to their hometowns as immediately as possible, but try to be thoughtful about ways that you can contribute and still be part of the community that raised you. Because, I'm a conservative in a very communitarian sense, where I think that we owe things to the place that really raised us, whether that's our country, whether that's our state, whether that's our community. And so I do try to encourage people, be thoughtful about the ways, not just that you can sort of make better policy, but be thoughtful about ways that you might be able to help your community, especially if that involves moving back, because I do worry a lot about this brain drain problem. I don't know that we can truly reverse that trend until we have a real cultural moment, maybe similar to the cultural moment we had about the ickiness of smoking, right? But where we really think to ourselves that there's something valuable and worthwhile about contributing to the community that you came from. I am sure that none of the students here will be surprised when I say that there's a real pressure here to acquire as many elite credentials as you can and to put as many jewels in your proverbial crown as you can, to go and get that elite consultancy, to go on to an elite grad school, to get that elite policy job in the White House or on Capitol Hill, basically to continue to accomplish as much as possible, continue to gather as many elite credentials as possible. I think that I worry about whether that's a little bit destructive to many of the people in this room, whether that constant obsession with credentials is actually in the best interests of you guys. But I certainly don't think it's in the best interests of our country, because elite credentials are unfortunately not to be found in Middletown, Ohio. There is no top 100 law firm or financial firm or venture capital firm that's going to allow me to do what I want to do and that's headquartered in the hometown that I grew up in. But nevertheless, I found my way to get back, and I think that other people, especially those who are talented enough to be in this room, can find different ways to get back and different ways to contribute. So my plans there are, one, I don't really have to have much of a plan because the book takes up so much of my time and traveling around takes up so much of my time that I haven't had to think constructively about what I'm going to do next. But I really would. I'm going to stay with my current venture capital fund, and I'd really like to think about inventive ways to bring capital back into these areas that are so undercapitalized, because as much as I believe in community institutions and as much as I think there are things that government could do to help this problem, unless private sector employment really starts to re-engage with some of the areas I care about, none of the problems that I write about in the book are really going to get that much better.
Hi.
Hi.
Sorry.
It's a very bright light.
Thank you. So you talk a lot about how the solution to the problem has to come from within, but you also discussed at length in the book the unwillingness of the people to face the problems. So I was actually wondering what the reaction at home was to your book, and if you could talk a little bit about that, and if it changed anything.
Sure. So there were a couple audiences I had in mind when I wrote the book, and one audience is the people that I'm writing about back home, and that's one of the reasons I wanted to write it in a more personal way, because I do think that we have to wake up a little bit to the fact that these problems are significant, and if we don't wake up to it, then we're never going to do the things necessary to start to rebuild these community institutions, to start to bring businesses back and so forth. So I've been gratified that many people from back home actually have read the book, and I would say that most of the comments that I get are not from, sort of so-called coastal elites, but they're from people who grew up in areas not unlike the area I grew up in, who are reading the book and engaging with it and seem especially concerned about it. The reaction is largely positive, I would say. I've been lucky. I just haven't gotten that many negative reactions. But there's a difference between a positive reaction, this book really helped me, this book really made me think about things in a new way, or I really like that book. That's one sort of positive reaction. Another sort of positive reaction is this book encouraged me to actually think about ways that I can start to deal with this problem. And it's an interesting question that hasn't been nearly as common of a comment, but I do hear it a fair amount. I definitely hear from a number of people that they're looking for ways to deal with the opioid crisis. They're looking for ways to get maybe their big mega church that's primarily located in an upper income area to be more involved in some of the poor communities that surround it. I think so. I do think that there has been some positive reaction on that front. The one negative reaction that I get relatively commonly is a fear that I paint too bleak a portrait, right? That I write about people, and if you pick up my book and read it, you would assume that everyone who grew up in this area is struggling in some fundamental way. And I try to be explicit that I'm not trying to do that, and I think most people have gotten, when I say most people aren't living this life, just a very large minority is living this life. Most people tend to get it, but that's been one negative reaction that I've gotten, is people fearing that it's a little bit too negative. Thank you.
Hi, how are you doing?
Hi.
I'm Steve Feiner, and I actually grew up in New Haven County, so this is my area of the country. So from a liberal perspective, if you're a smart, well-spoken conservative guy who come from the country, the United States has been urbanizing for the past several decades, if not over a century. That's what is driving our economy. As you said, 2/3 of our economy comes from major city areas. And to be honest, 145 counties have half of the U.S. population. So convince me that we should bother investing in the suburban and rural areas of our country when it would really behoove us just to have more people come to the thriving urban capital centers, which are driving the globalized economy of the 21st century.
So the question raises a really important point about how much we should be worried about place-based policies, right? And I'm one of these weird people who, from the moment I left in 2003 when I went to the Marine Corps, I've obsessed about going back home eventually. I've just always really wanted to do it. And I'm sure that I bring a certain bias to this conversation because of it, because I sort of think that people are not just purely rational economic actors, that we have these attachments to place and community that are relevant, and if we don't deal with them in the way that we think about policy or various social problems, that we're missing something. Now, that said, one of the things that I really worry about is that this urbanization, which of course is very important and it drives a lot of our economic activity and it will continue to do so, is that our cities actually are very foreclosed places, right? There are books written about this, The Gated City, so forth. Robert Ellickson, who's a professor at Yale Law School and has written about this. We're really bad in our urban areas at actually opening up quality housing, quality opportunities to people who don't make a whole lot of money, right? So in San Francisco, and we're going to have different answers to this, and my answer as a conservative to this, and I think this is one of the few issues where I'm pretty ideological, meaning that I think the conservatives are almost all the way right about this, is that we make it incredibly hard to build housing in new areas. And the reason we make it hard to build housing in urban areas is because the landowners that already exist, they consistently lobby against new building, right? It drives down their housing prices, it brings new people into their communities, and they really just don't want a ton of poor and middle class people flooding into San Francisco or flooding into New York because of complex reasons, but they don't. And so consequently, it's nearly impossible for a person making even a middle class wage to live in Manhattan. It is certainly impossible for a person making a middle class wage to live in San Francisco. And I don't think the answer is purely that we should be thinking about how to bring West Virginia back. I think we should be thinking about how easy or hard is it for people who want to move to some of these areas, who want to access the economic opportunities that exist in our urban core, they're actually unable to, right? I think this is the flip side of some of the debates that we often have, typically focused on minority communities about gentrification, right? So I think that you're making an important point, but just because the urban centers will continue to be a powerhouse of economic activity, don't assume that we shouldn't be doing things to give people access to those urban cores, because we find that geographic mobility in the United States is as low as it has been since any point in the post-war era. And a big reason for why people aren't moving to new opportunities in a way that they were in the 40s and 50s and 60s is because the places that have opportunities are just too expensive to actually live.
Hi, my name is Paul, and I go to the Yale Law School as well. And like many of the people here, your book really resonated with me because I grew up in Michigan. I also went to the University of Michigan. Don't worry, we can still be friends.
Next question.
But I grew up in a town of about 1,600 people, and when I had my parents come and visit Yale, I started to notice this sudden shift in our relationship that took place over the course of several years, where they constantly started to indicate that they had a hard time relating to my life and experience outside of Michigan. And so you've talked about brain drain, and you're going back to Ohio, so I have kind of a two-part question. The first part is, how do you personally feel about going back and your relationships that you have there, and maybe some distrust or weird relationships or weird interactions you have with people back home because you went to a place like Yale and lived in San Francisco for so long. And then I'm also gay, and for people that you're talking about going back home to help out in their communities, I was wondering for people who might feel marginalized by church or other community structures that take place in rural areas, do you have any suggestions or advice for them if they want to go back and help their communities?
Sure. Well, thank you for that question. And it's something, I should say, I hear this a lot, and it's something I've experienced in my own life a lot, right? You sort of get to a place like this, and you don't just feel like an outsider, but you start to, in some ways, drift away from people back home whose experiences are just so different. It's a really significant problem, right? And I think it's a consequence of the culture we have in our country, where there is such a firm geographic division between those who are doing relatively well and those who aren't, right? I mean, it's a consequence of the fact that your parents know so few people who have been in an institution like this. Maybe you're the only person who's been in an institution like this, so it seems a lot more foreign than it would be if we had more upward mobility and we had more kids like you who were going to places like Yale and then coming back with various stories. I just think it's a natural consequence of the fact that we're so divided by culture and geography that people start to feel like this. I personally, I'll answer this question in a different way. Yes, I felt personally about moving back to Ohio, and I feel generally very positively about it. You know, I'm not too worried about feeling like a cultural outsider. And part of that is because I've been cognizant of what you just mentioned, and I've tried to really fight against it. And I remember when I was a 2L and somebody in my family had a heroin overdose, and I was incredibly stressed out and just in a really bad place emotionally because of it. And I didn't feel like I could talk to anybody at Yale because none of them could possibly understand an experience like that. And I was starting to feel distant from my sister, who is in many ways the most important person in my life, or certainly was until I met my wife. And, you know, I was afraid to talk to Lindsay, but when I picked up the phone and really confessed to her that it made me feel a little weird that she thought that I was becoming a cultural outsider, it opened up an incredible conversation that I will never forget. It is one of the best conversations I've ever had in my life. So a bit of unsolicited personal advice: be open with the people who love you about this feeling, because if you don't, it can ossify and it can become a really significant problem. And not everybody's going to be lucky enough to have a sister like I did, but I think having that conversation might lead to very productive places. So that's one bit of advice. This question of marginalized groups and how they can contribute to communities that may not necessarily be super supportive to them. That's a really tough question, and I understand that this is incredibly fraught territory because I'm talking as a straight white male. I obviously don't share all of the experiences of different groups, and so I'll try to tread lightly, but take my advice with a grain of salt on that one. I think that it's important to keep in mind that when you reach a certain level of success and achievement, and I tend to think of that as fundamentally a blessing or the consequence of good luck, that you owe it to people who haven't been as lucky as you. So while I don't doubt that you've experienced things that aren't very good, and I'm sure you have a lot of experiences that I've never had, that I wouldn't want to have, and that I feel terrible that other people have had them, there's a gay kid, I guarantee you, in your neighborhood who has a worse life than you and would really benefit from someone like you coming back home and playing a positive role in the community. Again, that's not to say that everybody should do it. That's not to say that it won't be hard. But I really think that when you've had certain opportunities and when you've been fortunate like I have, and I'm sure you feel a certain amount of gratitude in your own life, that we really owe something not just to our families but to the communities that gave birth to us and nurtured us. And I hope that the fact that some of these institutions aren't as welcoming as they should be or as they could be won't totally dissuade you from actually going back and making a difference, because I think that you definitely could. Thank you.
One more question, so I'm just going to go right up here.
Hi, Semper Fi, and thank you for your service.
Semper Fi, thank you.
You're going around the country, and I read your book recently, and even read a little excerpt in class today about what like walking off the bus in boot camp and how that was like. But I'm a grandson of French Canadian immigrants, and It seemed like I was reading my story. Do you get a lot of, as you travel around the country, people saying, you know, I'm not a hillbilly, but gosh, you nailed it?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I do get a lot of that, and it obviously makes me feel pretty good to know that people who don't necessarily share the exact same sort of geographic or ethnic background that I do share a lot of the same experiences. I mean, I'm going to sound trite for a little bit, but I think that it speaks to the fact that there are a lot of common experiences. There are a lot of common problems. And one of the reasons that I wrote the book is that I thought the conversation about culture and poverty had been so racialized in a certain way, that we always brought it up in the context of black people, that it, one, allowed a lot of us to ignore some of these problems because we didn't see them in our day-to-day life, but also, really importantly, that it became sort of easy to say those problems exist in those other people's communities. And that's, I think, a really destructive mindset to have, because these problems exist in every community. And I think we recognize that we might be, one, a little bit more empathetic and compassionate about it, but two, we might be willing to have the tough conversations necessary to solve some of these problems, right? I don't think that we're always going to need to be compassionate to communities that aren't doing especially well. Sometimes the answer is, here are the things that we need to be doing better ourselves. That's a message that I have in the book. Sometimes the message is, here are government policies that might be able to help. Sometimes the message is, here are other things that might be able to help. But it's really hard to have that conversation when you approach these problems fundamentally as an outsider. So I did hope to tear down some of those conversational barriers, and I've been very happy that at least some people think that I have. Thank you. And thank you, guys. I know that's the last question.